Hey there, friends. Welcome to the Being Brown and Bold podcast. I'm your host, Jess Thomas. We are so glad you're joining us for all our amazing conversations about stepping out of our comfort zone, being bold, and taking chances. Today, I am chatting with Renji Bijoy. He is the founder of Immersd, a Techstars startup partnered with Facebook, HTC, and Microsoft to build VR offices, which has raised $12 million to date. Renji is part of 2021's Forbes 30 Under 30, receives a master's degree from Georgia Tech, and went to seminary, and was the lead software architect at greatbigstory.com. And he also has an amazing presence on social media. I definitely recommend following him because that's what I'm doing. And it's been such an encouragement for me, especially being from a Brown background and seeing Renji representing for us. So Renji, it is so great to have you here on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So to get started, tell us about your name, how you pronounce it, what it means.
I mean, Renji, that's how you say it. It's like Benji with an R. People have told me that they've heard of Japanese names or Filipino names that are the same. But yeah, when Googling it, I've seen different definitions of what it even means. So I forget exactly what it means. I think there's one definition that says like victorious warrior. There's one that says like either honest or direct or something like that. Like, so yeah, I mean, I don't know what more to say about that, but yeah, just my entire life.
Given to you. Like even, I think about like other Malayali families and every kid starts with the same letter or they rhyme. I don't know if you have that in your family.
My sisters, they do have that kind of the last part of their name. Like there's a LYN at the end of their names, but for me, my name doesn't rhyme with anyone's name. It's just, I guess my parents like the name. So
me and my brother both start with the J. All three of my kids start with the J. My nephew, my brother-in-law had two kids that both started with a J, and then they just had the third kid, and she starts with an A. Like, what are you doing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess it's somewhat similar. Like my mom and my oldest sister have the same first initial, and then me and the middle sister have the same first initial, but it sounds nothing alike. So, yeah.
I feel like that's one of I don't know, our things coming from a Kerala background that I noticed that happening. So I didn't know if that was also in your.
Yeah, thing. I wonder why people care about that. I don't get why they care about that. It's not like it's easier. Like you name whatever you want and you still remember the names. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, how did that become a thing anyway?
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. What does it mean to be you?
Yeah, so my parents moved from India to New York about 40 years ago. And I mean, the hard part was their degrees did not translate to like an American degree. And so their degrees didn't really count for anything. And so they had to kind of just do the stereotypical jobs, things like, taxi cab driver, convenience stores, things like that. Whereas, I've seen other families where their parents figured out ways to like be a doctor or a surgeon or other things like that. My parents are neither doctors or surgeons or anything. And so, and so my mom ended up becoming a nurse. So she had to like redo her degree here in the US, which sucks because she did all of that in India, but I guess they just didn't let it translate. So she had to do it again, start over here in the US. And so, especially early on, I think because a lot of Indian families they have their own version of keeping up with the Joneses in a sense where they just kind of like want to show everyone else that they're thriving in this sort of new promised land or new world or whatever you want to call it, land of opportunity. And, it definitely wasn't the case for us where my parents weren't making a lot of money like some other families or everyone was trying to figure out their way to get ahead. But at the end of the day, like if you didn't inherit millions of dollars from your ancestors, your parents or their parents, and you were starting from scratch, well, I mean, my parents are trying to figure out their own version of that American dream, right? So, living in New York, definitely lived in a rough area just because we couldn't afford much. And by the time I was 8, I think it just got too rough to the point where my parents were like, all right, we just got to get out of here because this is just not a very safe environment to raise kids. And so they heard about a bunch of other families moving to the suburbs of Atlanta or the suburbs of Georgia because apparently the government was helping subsidize a lot of cost of people moving out there, and you'd get a 5-bedroom home for half the cost of a house in New York that would have been half the size of New York, and more land. The kids could go outside and play in the cul-de-sac, not worried about drive-by shootings and things like that. So moved to Atlanta when I was 8. My parents, my sisters, all of us had to kind of uproot from New York, my parents from their jobs, my sisters and I from our schools, and kind of learn how to do that in a much more white context than we were in before. In New York, at least it was multicultural, but in Atlanta, we were some of the few brown people and just had to learn how to adapt, right? And that's the part that was definitely rough because the very next year after we moved to Atlanta, 9/11 happened. And, little did we know, especially if you're a bearded brown guy, it's just something that would, kind of just negatively affect you for the rest of your life. And you have to kind of figure out how to navigate life. I think the hard part was, especially when I became an adult and started flying more for work, it's weird because I don't know. I know a lot of my Black friends and white friends are on different sides of their argument as far as racial tension in America. The hard part is, as soon as we step into an airport, white and Black unite against the brown person. And so it's definitely a different type of experience. And it's something that just makes it very difficult to figure out, okay, well, in what context am I welcome? In what context can I get ahead? And so that's why you'll probably see me more in a technological office workspace where people assume I know what I'm talking about because I'm just some Indian guy in tech, as opposed to flying the world and traveling, whatever. I'll travel here and there by necessity, but I have to figure out my own ways to do it in a comfortable way. So,
do you where your family moved to in Georgia? Is it still homogenous culturally, or has it gotten diverse over time?
No, I mean, it's still pretty just white. It's about an hour outside of Atlanta. So if you go into the city of Atlanta, it's actually 60% Black, 30% white, and then 10% other. But in the suburbs of Georgia, I mean, it's just predominantly just white. It's just because, generations of it being the South and minorities feeling just kind of afraid of what that means to kind of be in more of a Confederate type state or a Confederate historical state. It's something where they're like, hey, let's just kind of go to the major city areas where it's less acceptable to be racist and we can live a little more comfortable life. So,
wow. So then how has this cultural background informed your life and your work?
Yeah. I mean, kind of when I went to undergrad, I actually was pre-med, even though I now work in the tech world. I was pre-med because my parents, they wanted me to be a doctor, as a lot of Indian parents want their kids to be, but I knew that my passions weren't really there. Not that I don't want to help people. Like I did well in my classes in undergrad. In high school, I didn't do very well, but in undergrad, I did actually very well. And so I, applied to med schools. I got into med schools, but when it was time to actually commit to one, I knew that I loved coding way more than I loved, waking up in the morning and going to a hospital floor and doing rounds and things like that. Like I shadowed and stuff. And that's how I knew this is not something I would want to wake up the rest of my life doing. And I also kind of did some internships as a coder and I loved it. And so I was like, all right, well, if I'm going to med school just for my parents, I know I'm not doing it for myself. So I ended up throwing all those acceptance letters in the trash and my parents are super upset with me. But I mean, now they're happy because they've seen me be a lot more successful in the tech world, but their fear was I wouldn't stand out. Their fear was that I would be just like every other kid who's making 60K as a coder, as opposed to, doctors can make 300 to 800K depending on what they do. And so I guess what I also realized was not only did I love coding, but God had sort of wired my brain to be pretty good at it. Because I know that, people are passionate about a lot of things, right? I'm also passionate about basketball or gaming or whatever, but I'm not gonna be LeBron James, right? And so and I also am not gonna devote 40, 50, 60 hours a week of my life towards gaming to become a pro gamer anymore. Like I just that's not something that I want to do. So what I realized was I need to kind of do something that not only am I passionate about and I enjoy, but also something that I'm really, really good at. And so coding was that thing. And then on top of that, in the tech world, people just gave me the benefit of the doubt, assuming I know what I was talking about because I'm brown, right? And so they're like, a lot of Asian / brown people in tech are pretty strong in building technology. And so they oftentimes just kind of go with the flow with whatever you say. And so I started noticing in my different work contexts when I worked at larger companies as a coder that people would just take my word for it. I mean, fortunately, I wasn't just making stuff up and I did know what I was talking about, but there were other times I could definitely notice where people would just kind of identify that I was probably the person that they wanted to follow as opposed to someone else. And so not that was always racially based versus merit based, but to be real, it probably helps. And there's definitely contexts where here's another example. Whenever there have been women in the tech world who have something that they want to say, I've definitely seen people condescend that, and a lot of people be more combative, which is not fair for them. And so I will say I definitely did have an advantage as a male in the tech world. And so for me, I just started gravitating towards that because that was a world where I was really accepted. Whereas when it came to things that, things like travel, I have had too many bad experiences at airports where I generally try to avoid it. And this actually it's gotten so bad to the point where I mean, this sounds kind of outlandish, but like one of my own personal goals in life is to just have access to, it sounds really stupid, but like have access to a private jet so I could just bypass security, have no problems, and then just like get to my destination. Not that I even care about having the status of a private jet. I just care about having low friction going through security and then getting to point B, and then just like have convenience. Because there's really like stupid petty things. Like usually every other time I'm at the airport, I'll be randomly selected for inspection, or there are times where I just have literally my shaving razor and they'll take it and throw it out. Be like, no, it's a weapon. I'm like, there are other people here who have shaving razors and you're throwing mine out. And I have to go to my final destination and then go find another razor. I have to go to like a local store and buy it. So just like little things like that. So I've had to kind of figure out where I fit in society, especially because we're not in India, and like it's not like everyone here kind of feels. It's something I've always thought about. Like I think it's something that's unique in America where you have this melting pot of a bunch of different types of cultural backgrounds. Whereas when you go to visit countries in either Europe or India, Asia, wherever, weirdly, there's more of a family vibe there. It's almost as if they just like kind of grew up in that village, or they just know all these people, and everyone's very comfortable with each other, and people have each other over for dinner. Even if you're technically strangers, they'll just have people in their homes. But if you look at the pattern, it's because everyone kind of looks like each other. And that's something I wonder if it's just a manifestation of living life on this side of eternity, where it's just like people don't trust each other if they don't look or feel like each other, or don't have the same sort of cultural references. And I know that there's unique context here and there in the US where that's the case with people who look different. But that being said, one thing that I do really miss from being more involved with the Indian church growing up was how much of a family environment everything did feel like. Though there were definitely, as I grew up, definitely conflicts in my mind as far as the exclusivity of those communities, where they wouldn't allow other people who didn't look like them into those communities. There was a little sense of, I do miss some of that sort of village family, broader family type vibe, where you can just go to a random uncle or auntie, ask them for candy, and they'll just give it to you, right? As a little kid. So.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that is really difficult to feel like you are being singled out just because of the way you look. And it's not just feeling, it's literally that is what's happening to you. It's happened to me. So my last name is Thomas. One time I got stopped at the airport, like, no, what's your real name? I'm like, the one on the passport. And I was like, really?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, okay.
They expected like some sort of like long, confusing name or something.
Right. I'm like, let me tell you, 2000 years ago, what had happened was one of the disciples, I don't know if you know that there was a guy named Jesus and he had 12 followers. One of those guys came to India, and a lot of our names are similar. So I gave him the whole history lesson. And that's why this is my name. Can you help me rebook my flight now?
Oh, wow.
Don't mess with me. Okay. Anyway. So when you were little, is this the life that you imagined for yourself, or what did you imagine your life would look like?
I don't know. I guess like when I was little, I didn't think about the future as much as I do now. When I was little, I lived in the moment a lot more than I do now. And that's maybe a lesson in itself to myself today. But yeah, as a kid, like I knew that I really loved gaming. I loved playing sports and things like that. It might sound typical, but for me, I was pretty obsessive. Like when I used to play video games, mainly in middle school and early high school, I wouldn't just play here and there. I would play like 10 hours a day every day. And it got to the point where I essentially was a professional gamer. So that's something that I did take seriously as a kid. But as I was so focused on those things, I wouldn't really think about the future that much until like even to the point where in high school, I had a 2.6 GPA because I just cared about friends and hanging out and working out and sports and whatever. I didn't think about, like in 6 months I have to be applying to colleges and I need good grades for that. I wouldn't even think about that. So, but then, fast forward to today, I'm so future focused that it prevents me from being so like focused enough on the present. And so, I guess I've just swung so far the opposite end of the pendulum that I know I need to be a more sort of centered person.
So then, you started off with gaming, and I mean, you went to Emory for your undergrad. So your
Yeah, Emory
GPA
undergrad,
wasn't
and
that bad.
well, no. Here's the thing, though. So I actually went to Georgia State my first year to almost like prove that I wasn't bad at school. I was just lazy in high school. So I graduated high school with a 2.6 GPA. So it was not good. If I had a 3.0, I would at least would have had a scholarship to pay for that first year of college. But because I had less than a 3.0, I had to pay out of pocket for that first year of college. And Georgia State was the only school that even accepted me. So everyone else, just all rejections. But when I went to Georgia State, I was 17 years old, $7,000 in debt, and I'd never seen $7,000 in my life. So I was like, wait, how am I starting at negative 7,000? So that like really was a figurative punch to the face to like wake up. And I immediately started applying myself because the 7,000 wasn't coming out of my parents' pocket; it was coming out of mine. And I appreciate them for doing that, for not just absorbing the consequences for me, but making me face those consequences. Part of it was by necessity; they couldn't afford it, but also part of it was I think some parents would maybe even like sell cars in order to pay for stuff, and like my parents like maybe you can figure this out. And so I started working full time, and I was paying for school. I was working at Office Depot as a laptop salesperson, also while going to undergrad at Georgia State. And I started applying myself. And I was like, if I'm paying for these classes, I'm going to get a really good grade. And I ended up getting at Georgia State, they had A pluses. So I ended up getting A pluses in all my classes. So I graduated after, sorry, not graduate, but I ended that first year at Georgia State with a 4.3 GPA. And then that's when I was able to transfer to Emory to finish out the rest of undergrad. And then I went to Georgia Tech for grad school because I was pre-med in undergrad. I felt like I did myself a disservice because I wasn't focused on computer science like I really wanted to. And so I just did computer science master's at Georgia Tech.
Wow. So as you're even telling this story, I'm thinking about the boldness of your parents. One, coming to America, expecting this type of life, which wasn't what they had planned. And then because of their careers, having to redo education, then relocating to Georgia, that in itself is another bold move. And I think it is very bold when immigrant parents don't pay for their kids' school. Like rarely hear that. So for your parents to, it's by necessity, but like you're saying, some parents will be like, no, I have to sacrifice everything because that's why we came to this country. I did this for my kids. So even that just makes me like, wow, your parents like were bold, and like kudos to them for letting you live your life.
Yeah, I think part of it also was because I had two older sisters who they did absorb more of the consequences there, but then they also saw that the ROI kind of wasn't that worth it, meaning they paid for a lot of their schooling, but in the end, my sisters ended up like shifting careers anyway. And they're like, why do we pay all this money if it's not going to result in the expected outcome? And then also at the same time, my parents always would say things like, oh, you're our only son. You're going to make it. You're going to figure it out. All of that. I will say that is something that they really did. That's something that they really did. Something that they did that really impacted me positively was how much they believed in me, like almost irrationally. It was weird, but it's almost like as if like if Renji didn't figure it out, we're all gonna die, that sort of thing. And they would say that, but that's kind of the vibes I got of like, if I don't figure this thing out, my family is not gonna we're gonna struggle forever, or we're gonna be homeless, or so I'm not gonna let myself be a burden to my family. Like I understand that like just in the way America is wired, unfortunately, it's not as equal between male and female in the U.S. Even to as much as there's a social push towards that, it's still not the case. There's still sort of underlying advantages that a lot of guys do get. And I saw a lot of disadvantages my sisters got. And I was like, all right, well, if a lot of these things are working against them and I have things that are working in my favor, then I better push forward and make it worth it. And so I really did. That's why it was hard to explain to my parents why I thought it was actually better for me to say no to med school and actually better for me to say yes to kind of the coding world, because they didn't really know about guys like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or whatever. They just know, oh, doctors are like the highest status in society, and that's the highest pay you can get from any sort of paycheck. And I was like, no, but there's this other world you're not as exposed to. And when they think technology, they think customer support IT. They don't think the people who built these things. And so for me, like I really did want to, and I still do want to kind of do what I can to take care of my family, if that makes sense, because we weren't as successful growing up. And not that that's the most important thing in life, but I know that money doesn't solve all these problems, but it does solve your money problems. And one thing that is rough is that, especially with people in your family who may not be as devout in their faith, or technically might not even be believers, it's hard to have a sense of peace in that family when people are actually spiritually at odds with one another. And the hard part is, as my parents are getting older, and my mom's a solid believer. My dad, he kind of just like is here and there with it, and obviously that causes a lot of tension. And usually the biggest source of fights is money. And for me, like, I know that the Lord can open up my dad's eyes and redeem him way more than any sort of money can solve any of that. And so that's why it's so important for us to continue praying for my dad's eyes to open up in that way. But also at the same time, like, because they're still in position, fast forward 40 years, they're still in financial struggle. That's why I do feel a level of desire to take care of my parents, right? Like, a lot of people are able to retire their parents at a certain point in their career. I wish I was able to do it earlier, but I trust God in the process that he has us in. And, I'm grateful, and my hope is to be able to retire them this year. So I'm super thankful for what the Lord has done. And yeah, I just want my parents to be comfortable for the next, hopefully, maybe 10, 15, 20 more years that they have here on this earth. Yeah.
It sounds like it's been a roller coaster, honoring your parents from what they expected of you, but then what they expected of their own lives. Do you feel that struggle with honoring them even today as you're pursuing your dreams?
Not anymore. And the hard part is when you end up being successful, if you end up being successful in your career, then your parents kind of don't really care what you do for a living, as long as it's something they can brag about. So that's kind of the sad reality of the situation. Like, I think if I was just a coder, meaning like, so by the time I was 23, I graduated when I was 21. By the time I was 23, I was a lead software architect. So by God's grace, I was making kind of the most you could make as a software engineer. Usually takes people about 10, maybe more like 15 years to get that level in their career. And again, as I said earlier, like, by God's grace, my brain was just wired for that in a way I didn't realize. And so I kind of climbed the ranks within about 2 years out of undergrad. And if I continued just as sort of that software architect type of route, my parents would have been okay with it, but it's not something that they would brag about. And thus there would always be sort of this thing in the back of their head where they're like, man, I wish my son was a doctor instead. But, just coincidentally, because of the fact that I decided to start, build our own company, and it does a lot better than what I would just be doing if I was just a coder at someone else's company. And because it's something that my parents can brag about, I think that's kind of why they're okay with it. So I don't really have, and that's, I think, just more of a coincidence. Is, I guess, the sad reality of culture and kind of how families always try to keep up with the Joneses, sort of thing. And it also, I think, is something that, like, I think you mentioned even before this podcast, that, like, because you're successful in your career, people kind of look at you as sort of like a figure in that space. Likewise with me, like, a lot of, I guess, a lot of my parents' peers and their kids look at me as sort of a role model for their kids, because they want a lot of their kids to sort of aspire to that sort of stuff. And it's funny because I'm very, I kind of don't care about that. I guess what I mean by that is I have other friends who have done a great job in their career, and they're sort of a role model in their field. And some of them like being famous. Some of them like kind of the attention and all of that. And so it's funny to see that. And also it's funny to see when someone doesn't recognize them, how they feel with that. For me, I'm just used to just not being recognized, but in contexts where, like, for example, my wife and I went to Dallas to go see our new nephew, who was just born a couple months ago. And my mom asked if me and my wife can come to one of the prayer meetings and stuff. And it was a little bit weird because everyone was staring, and I just didn't really, I keep forgetting that, especially in the Malayali community, a lot of people recognize me. Because I'm generally here in Austin, Texas, I'm not in very many Malayali contexts at all, like, ever. But online in Malayali context, I guess I'm somewhat a familiar face. like another example. And so when I was at that pyramid, just everyone constantly staring, and then afterwards, people just wanted to like connect with me and like take photos and things like that, and just like send it to other people. It was really
Wow,
weird.
they wanted to do
Yeah,
selfies with you?
yeah. Like here's how bad it's gotten before. Like this sounds so bad, but I'm just tell you how it is. So at my grandmother's funeral, I was in New York, and it's so bad that even at the funeral, people had no regard for the fact that we were at
Wow.
my grandmother's funeral, and they're still like wanting to take selfies and send it to their friends and stuff. And I'm like, dude, this is my grandmother's funeral, dude. And like, I wasn't laughing. I was just like, very, just like, I didn't
Right.
like push it off. I was like, yeah, that's, it's fine. And like, it's just such a weird thing. But that being said, like, I understand, I guess, to a certain extent, why people feel that way. I guess people just need some sort of goal to aspire towards, in a sense. And so I like being a role model for people, if that's what that has to be. Another example, I was at actually one of the guys on my team, another Malayali guy, at his father's funeral. Same thing. Everyone just constantly staring. Everybody just constantly. So it's weird in those contexts, because again, what's funny is I don't know how to operate in those contexts, because I'm usually not in those contexts. Whenever I'm in, like, I may be in some sort of like specifically Malayali context, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, if that, maybe once or twice a year. And because it's so infrequent, I forget how to even like normally respond, because I'll do a big keynote speeches elsewhere, but like in multicultural contexts, but those people already don't know me, right? So for example, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I was on a panel on stage with Lecrae, the CEO of Intel, and some other, Nona Jones, who she's like kind of the head of YouVersion on the marketing side, and then some other CEOs and stuff. And no one knew me. And so for me, it's just very easy just to be myself, because no one knows me anyway. I'm just gonna be myself. But when I'm in context where people like overly recognize my face, I'm just not used to that. And so I don't really know how to appropriately respond to that. Whereas guys like Lecrae or Tim Tebow, like, or even for example, I've probably gotten the most deep with Andy Mineo on this particular side of things. I've asked him, what is that like to like have people constantly recognize you, but also like violate boundaries? Like, how bad has it gotten? And he said one time he was in the men's restroom, and a guy came right up next to him, like at the urinal, and was trying to take a selfie. It's like, he's
No.
like, yo, I need some privacy. Can you go away? He's like,
Wow.
yeah. I'll meet you outside the bathroom then. So anyways, this kid goes outside. It was just like a 14-year-old kid. So I guess the kid was just whatever. Anyways, Andy's like, yeah, I'll see you outside. Just go away. He went outside to, wait. Him and his mom was there, or him and the kid's mom and the kid were waiting outside the bathroom. And he was like, all right, let's take a selfie, I guess. And so Andy put his arm around the kid, and the kid just like flipped out, and the kid was like, get off me, get off me. But so it turns out he had sort of like a social disorder sort of thing. But
Okay.
so that's kind of, it makes sense why he didn't read that signal, don't take a selfie at a urinal. But the fact that Andy even had to go through that to start with, like, I'm thankful I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Wow. That's a story. May that never happen to you.
Yeah.
For those who don't know who Andy Mineo is, if you've been on any Instagram reels in 2020, 21, coming in hot was
Yeah.
everybody's song on reels. So
Yeah.
that's who that is. So, wow. Okay. Well, I can't even imagine. I mean, the funeral stories, I'm like, I think,
That's kind of crazy.
yeah, that people don't understand, how to give privacy and respect, or like understand the context of things.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, talking about Indian culture, a central focus in the life of a brown person is marriage. And I know, like, those of us who grew up here, my circle, we were told you shouldn't be dating, finish all your education, then get a job, then maybe you think about getting married, and then maybe you can choose your spouse. We don't know, but dating is for after you get married, then you date your spouse. Does any of this echo with your story and the way you were raised?
Well, what's funny is, and then on the flip side of that, if you end up being like 30 years old and you're not married yet, your parents think something's wrong with you. It's like, well, you told me not to talk to anyone of the opposite gender for the first 30 years of my life, and now you're upset with me. Anyways, for me, I think in general in high school, I was a pretty rebellious kid. So I only became a believer when I was 19. And so as a kid, I was generally, unregenerate kid. People don't realize this, but I was actually a pretty big problem child. Like I would get into fights and all that. And honestly, I hid a lot of my fights from my parents. Like I figure out ways to just like not get in trouble as much. But in high school, I'd get into fight. It was like a really, really bad thing. And a lot of it was a lot of pent up anger for, I guess a decade almost of just a lot of racism and all of that in the suburbs of Georgia. But yeah, so when I became a believer when I was 19, my convictions around dating and marriage and all of that became very, very different from kind of what my parents' desires for me as a Malayali Indian kid growing up, right? So for them, they wanted me to do the typical thing of marry a Malayali Pentecostal specifically person, and that didn't end up happening. I had dated a couple of different people, but I just didn't really. At the end of it, I actually got to the point where I wanted to stay single the rest of my life because as a believer, I actually at the time hadn't met anyone who I felt like would enhance the mission that I'm on. I actually felt the most impactful as a believer being single. And I understood what Paul was saying in was it 1 Corinthians 7 where he says it's better not to marry, or is it Romans 7? I mixed those two up. But he ultimately, like, because he's on mission, he doesn't have I guess family as, I don't know, collateral or whatever, just like a weak point. You'll see that in superhero stories where they don't even like target the superhero, they target the superhero's loved ones, and I guess whatever. So I guess like for me being on mission, I was like, all right, well, if this is gonna kind of get in the way of that, then I think I should just stay single. And so there was actually like sort of maybe about a year there where I was, I think 23, and I was just single and just focused. And there were different women who at the church would like talk to the pastor and be like, hey, like, why is Renji saying that he wants to be single, blah, blah. And like pastors would sit down with me and be like, hey, are you sure you want to do this and all that? And I'm like, yo, divorce is a bad thing, right? And maybe
are these aunties that are saying that, or are these like
no, I was going to no. I was actually at the time going to a multicultural church.
Okay.
And so when I became a believer, I didn't stay in the Malayali church for too long. After I became a believer, I stayed in the Malayali church for maybe a year and a half because I was trying to help out. But I think I was just maybe a little too radical for them to want me to stay around. And so it became very clear that I wasn't really welcome after about a year and a half. Just because a lot of the stuff that you see preached in scripture is very different from what you see in a lot of Indian cultural churches. And so what ended up happening was after about a year and a half of being in the Indian church, it was just very clear I wasn't welcome there anymore. And so I was like, all right, well, I guess I'll check out other churches. And so at the time I was going to just sort of a multicultural church. But yeah, this was just random people from college and stuff, all different sort of races and backgrounds who would talk to our pastors. Our pastors at that church were Black. There was a church in Atlanta called Blueprint Church. Actually, Lecrae and some of those guys actually helped plant that church before I got there. Anyway, so but when my wife ended up, well, my now wife ended up moving from Florida to Atlanta for a job, it was just coincidence that the community group that she was going to was the community group that I was going to. And I had noticed her from afar, and like, and by the way, she's not Malayali. And so, in my head, I was like, well, yeah, I'm probably gonna stay single anyway, so I don't have to worry about, bringing anyone to my parents. And so, but like I noticed that she was the type of person who was intentional with other women, and like a person who was already on mission on her own too. And come to find out, she was actually in a very sort of similar lane in life where she was like, I think I'm just gonna stay single and stay focused on my mission until the Lord calls me otherwise. And actually, like just being kind of around each other, she ended up saying, like I said something like, it's really cool to have another solid sister like in our community group, something like that, just because she was like really serving and being really reliable for a lot of other people. And then she said, she was like kind of joking but kind of not, saying yeah, but I want to be like an intentionally pursued solid sister. And so I was like, yeah, I'm just trying to stay focused, so no. And so I actually ended up rejecting her in that first conversation. Yeah, but she took it very well, and I was like, dang, she's too mature. I was like, all right, if there's anyone who's ever going to enhance the mission that I'm on, it'd probably be a woman like her. And so that's where, within a matter of days, I was like, really just like my focus or my thoughts and my feelings had really started turning towards her in a way that just never did for anyone else. And so I had more sort of clarifying conversations with her, and it just turns out that we were literally just on the same page about everything. Like for example, like I didn't want to kiss another person until it was my wife, or I didn't want to marry a wife who wanted to be a CEO of her own company. Like I'd rather marry someone who wants to be a mother of our children, sort of thing, just more focused on that full time. She was like, yeah, I mean, she was like, her mom was a mom full time because she had 5 siblings. And so for her, she's like, she just wants to be a mom, even though, she's a beast. Like she was valedictorian of her high school. She worked at Ernst & Young, was on partner trajectory there. And so she just crushed everything she's ever done. But she aspires to be a mom. I'm like, dang, well, we're just going to have a bunch of little Renji musks growing up. And so I'm really excited for when we do have kids. But anyways, I just knew we were on the same page in life. And I was like, well, I don't think I'm ever going to find anyone like you. And so it's like, might as well get married. And so we actually decided within like a week to get married before we actually started dating. But we dated for a year after that, just to not freak out her family and stuff, or not freak out my family. But after about a year of dating or courting, whatever you want to call it, and then 4 months of engagement, we ended up getting married. So now we've been married 7 years, which is crazy how long it's been. Yeah, and best decision of my life. So
yeah, that's really cool how, when you weren't looking, because that my husband was committed to celibacy before he met me also. And he's like, yeah, why would I get married when I can like do everything I'm called to do without being distracted? And so then I guess I distracted him, but it worked out okay.
Yeah. And I understand at the same time, like the Lord allows us to be intentional in ways that we probably couldn't have been had we been single. For example, like if we're trying to be intentional with other families or people who have kids or things like that, which in the tech world, especially people in their 40s and 50s, et cetera, who a lot of people who are my peers building companies, they have families, and it's helpful for me to be married and for us to have kids someday and all of that, to just kind of be in the same wavelength, same kind of lane in life. So
yeah. Has there been many challenges because it's a cross-cultural marriage?
At first, like before my parents met her, yes, because it was just sort of this idea that like Renji is not marrying a Malayali person. And then when they met her, because she's a solid believer who's very loving to people and very caring, their hearts melted. And ever since the first day they met her, they love her almost more than they love me. Like they're very close with her. They trust her. Her and my parents get along extremely well. And so, they treat her as their own biological child now. So,
which speaks volumes about her character and probably even just her confidence in her own identity of who she is. So that's amazing. Yeah. Okay, so you've had lots of different jobs since your high school years, and going from having a solid job and then starting your own company, which was a rocky road.
Yeah.
But now it's going pretty well. How do you make sure that you're taking care of yourself, your marriage, your friendships? Because I'm sure people listening are trying to live a meaningful life and do meaningful work, but it's a lot to do. And I know you all, especially because it's a startup, you're working a lot of hours to make it work, and things keep changing all the time. Like I've seen you post things of like, this is a secret and you're not actually showing us anything, but you're showing us something. But obviously big things are happening. That requires a lot of hours. How are you having, I don't even know if balance is the word, a rhythm? I don't know. Tell us all the secrets.
Right. I mean, I think for me, like, so naturally, it sounds weird and probably not very healthy, but like naturally, like me and my mom both are wired this way. We only usually sleep on average about 4.5 to 5 hours a night, which I know is not good. But the thing is, for me, if I sleep 8 or 9 hours, like I feel like how the regular person feels when they sleep 12 to 14 hours. You just feel groggy and just so slothful. For me, I almost have to maintain my sleep, meaning I have to like kind of cut off my sleep by the time I hit 6 hours. Like if I sleep more than that, then I just feel just like just horrible. And so for me, I naturally wake up after about 5 hours of sleep. Whereas my wife, she sleeps, my wife, similar, but polar opposite. She naturally sleeps about 10 hours. And so that gives me an extra like 35 hours a week that, she's not awake and I'm just working and stuff like that. But at the same time, because my job is fun and like I'm getting to build my own job and we're building our company, and like I would already be doing this if I wasn't getting paid to do it. It doesn't feel like I'm working 80, 90 hours, whatever. It just feels like I'm doing what I love for fun. And we also hire the same way, whereas every single person in this company is obsessed with it's so cool just to kind of see them in their own context with their own family and friends, talking about how much they love and use the product and talk to our users and all of that. It's such a cool thing. Also, my wife, she works half-time at the startup because she's really, like I mentioned before, she used to be an auditor at Ernst & Young. And so she's really, really good at doing back office stuff, which I hate doing that stuff. Like, HR benefits, like, payroll, stuff like that. It's so boring to me, but she loves that stuff because she's really good at checking things off. And so until we hire a CFO probably in the next year, she's going to keep helping out there. She used to do 40 hours at the company, but she's automated most of her job and now it's just maintaining. So we get to see each other every day at work, which is awesome. And then, I think kind of just outside of that, as far as our friendships and our community, our church, things like that. I think no matter what, like, because my job is very flexible, I'm able to just move stuff around to cater to friends and church community and whatever. So there's a lot. I do cut out a lot of things that are time wasters, though. Meaning, like, if I, like, for example, I don't play as much video games as a lot of other guys probably. I don't. I don't know. A lot of people watch a lot of TV. I watch just enough TV to keep myself maintained. Meaning, like, the job compresses you so much. Sometimes you just need to watch an episode of The Office or something to decompress. But I'll make sure just to watch one as opposed to watching like 10 episodes straight. And so it's just enough to help me decompress and then keep going. So I think it is a lot of discipline, but also your discipline eventually becomes a habit. And if that becomes a habit, then you just have better rhythms. And so, yeah, I personally don't call it work-life balance. You probably heard Jeff Bezos or some of these other people call it work-life integration or work-life harmony, where, again, if you really love what you do for your job, then you'll never work a day in your life, so to speak. But also at the same time, like, if a lot of people who are around you who also realize that your job is not only something that you love, it's also something that is long-term impactful. If that is what your job is, then they support you in that. And so I have a lot of friends who understand it. Like, for example, I overslept this morning. I didn't get to play basketball with some of these guys. And actually, I was one of the spots that were, it was reserved. And generally, they don't want people to flake because that's a spot that someone else could have had. Fortunately, there were extras there, so someone took my spot. But I overslept. I was like, "Oh crap, sorry guys," and like you don't even worry about it because they already know I have weird sleeping patterns. And so it's just something that you have to have the right community around you too, who knows how to operate with that. And so the hard part is a lot of my high school friends are probably not the same friends that I have today. And I'm still well acquainted with these people, but it's not like I'm spending all day every day with these people. The people who I spend the most time around are those who probably are living pretty similar lifestyles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen how you posted the early morning basketball. I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
that's such a great way to get your workout in and do community. And I feel like maybe at some point you had like younger guys there, so it's almost even like a mentoring type of thing as well. So I feel like
most of the people are young 20s. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, because you're now 30 or over 30 now, right?
31. Yeah.
Yeah, you're getting old now. So that's why you're sleeping in. Like, now you're shifting into needing the whole 6 hours of sleep. So
Right. Yeah.
just to let you know, like, so I'm 51. So yeah.
Oh wow, I didn't realize you're 51.
Yeah. So you're gonna get to this place where you're gonna wake up and be like, what's happening? Because I used to be able to do all of this, but now my body won't let me. So just letting you know, it's coming, but like on the opposite end, you have all this wisdom. So if your body's not doing what you wanted to do, at least you can rely on that wisdom.
Well, I already feel that in basketball now, where like I can't fly like I used to, but I'm trying to figure out what, like, the hard part is there are sort of these one-off people. Like, I've gotten whooped in basketball by a 45-year-old and a 61-year-old, and I'm like, how is that? And one of the guys are black and the other guy's white, and I'm like, it can't be just a genetic thing, because it's not like usually black people are pretty sturdy, but they both mentioned it's just discipline over the course of decades. I'm like, all right, well, I'll try my best to be disciplined. So I'm going to try not to make excuses for myself, at least. We'll see. Oh, and by the way, not that your thing was an excuse. I think for me, like, also when it comes to sleep, I'm already feeling that breakdown. I already feel like I'm starting to naturally get more sleep than I used to, but I'm probably hitting more like 6 hours these days now. So, which is good.
Which is good. That's a healthy thing. You don't want your cortisol levels to be too high. So
for sure. Yeah.
Go with that flow. As you've encountered in this field, people of all different faiths, and like you were saying, Indians have this reputation of being in coding, IT, and all that. So they're coming from different backgrounds. How do you, especially like people who are listening that are of different religions, how are ways that you live out your faith in a way that honors other people while staying true to your calling?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just a matter of, well, I'll say two things. So number one, like, being myself is important, right? So I don't allow other people's faith to dictate who I am or how I act, if that makes sense. So I'm just real, meaning like, so for example, there's a guy on my team who he is Muslim, He's actually moving from Pakistan to the US, or specifically to Austin, in 2 weeks. And him and I love each other. And also, by the way, like on my team at Immersd, there's about 6 of us who are believers and about 20 something of us who are not believers. But all the unbelievers on my team love the believers on my team. And so
like a real team where
yeah,
team doesn't mean you're all the same. Team means that you're unified.
exactly. Yeah. And so the thing is, like, we all love each other, respect each other. We don't get into theological or religious debates, because at the end of the day, like, Immersed is not Chick-fil-A where we hire only Christians. Internally at, or I know Chick-fil-A corporate, at least that's kind of, I don't know if it's a legal requirement, but it's at least an unspoken thing I've heard. But we're not a Christian company. We just have, I'm a Christian and there are Christians at Immersed, but we're not Christian. We're not Chick-fil-A, right? And so for us, like, number one, yeah, we're just real about who we are. And so I don't hide it, so that whenever someone joins the company, it's not like they find out and if they're anti-Christian, they explode or something. But rather, I just make sure that people are okay with the fact that I'm a believer, because at the end of the day, just the way I naturally talk, it comes out where I'll say things like, by God's grace, or, if the Lord wills, or, I'm about to have this meeting, please pray for me, that sort of thing. I just naturally talk that way. And if people are not okay with that, they probably shouldn't be led by a CEO who is that way. So they probably shouldn't be here to begin with. So, number one, I am myself, and these people are sons and daughters of peace who are open to that, who are okay with that. And then number two, when it comes to religion in general, at least my perspective is, like, I don't know. I don't see it as like a hobby. I don't like, just being straightforward, whether or not, whoever's listening is a Christian or not. Me being a Christian, it's not like something I was born with. It's not a genetic thing. It's not something I inherited. It is something that God opened up my eyes. It's a very real thing. It's not just like a thing that's for fun, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It's an experience that you're living out, because it's not a religious organization that you're ascribed to.
Yeah, and it's not tradition. Like, it's something that I can't choose to whether or not I really live it out, because if the Holy Spirit really does live in me, then I'm just doing what I feel in me, if that makes sense. And so I guess what I mean by that is, there are other people at my company who they do follow a certain religion just because their parents did it. And for them, it's more tradition than it is some sort of like life calling sort of thing. And so they know who they are if they listen to this podcast. And they also can't deny that. I've already talked with them about this. They've talked about it with me, where they're like, yeah, I just do it because my parents do it, but I don't really like feel anything. Whereas for me, it's who I am, if that makes sense. And so I don't, candidly, I don't really put it on the same playing field. Like, I just feel like it's just sort of like it's now just a part of who I am, if that makes sense. And so the only way a person wouldn't get that is if I was faking myself. And people, I've come to find out, don't want that. So, all right, well, if you want the real me, this is the real me. And so for the people on my team, yeah, they are the type of people who are okay with that. And they would actually prefer that, because they know it's the authentic, true self of who I am. And I think that what makes it even more desirable for them to want that version of me is the fact that they've been exposed to it and they see like what I mean by that. And if they had a different type of Renji, that's just not the Renji that they would want, if that makes sense. So, because it would just be a fake Renji, it just wouldn't be who I am. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. And what I've noticed in the past couple of years too, is I feel like, I don't know if it's a post-COVID thing or what, but I feel like people are talking about spirituality more than I've ever heard before, whether it's they follow a specific religion and they talk about how they're celebrating those holidays or what it means to them, or they're just talking about, I'm a spiritual person and I'm manifesting things, or I'm having, like feelings, but in general, I feel like talking about spirituality is more accepted now than I've ever heard. Like growing up, I did not hear that in my, couple of decades ago. So I feel like it's safer now to talk about spirituality, maybe because there's more tolerance, because people are like, oh yeah, like you're do this and I do that.
Yeah, I think it's I almost wonder if it's almost history repeating itself, or maybe not repeating itself, but at least like rhyming with previous seasons of history, where there are seasons of people not feeling like they can talk about it, and then seasons where people are like, yeah, but that's not real. And then they start swinging back, and then they kind of overdo it, and they feel like, oh, that's too much. And then it kind of goes back. And so it's just kind of this like whatever weird sort of wave or cycle. But this past sort of season of people being overly PC and saying, oh, that that's it's too exclusive. You can't talk about that. But then it's like, wait, but this is what I believe. It's like, oh, wait, right. We got to be inclusive. All right. Then we'll include that again. And it's just kind of this weird back and forth. And that's why for me, like irrespective of what culture decides at that season of time, I just come to find out that if I decide to be my true authentic self, then people in general prefer that. And I think at the end of the day, because I say it out of love rather than head knowledge, they usually don't get rubbed the wrong way. They usually have some level of empathy or compassion or affinity towards it. And so, yeah, I personally don't really see it as much of a rocket science, but more of just like a way of living.
Mm-hmm. So you're active on social media, and often when people are on social media, they see the highlights reel of our lives, right? But the reality is we all have our challenges and our obstacles. What is something that you're currently working on to grow and change?
Yeah. One thing that you and I talked about was smiling more when in public, because people think I'm angry when I'm just straight faced, but that's more of a kind of joke thing. I'm not something that I don't think it's like as deep a conviction just yet. I think it's one of my convictions, but I think kind of probably the more pressing things in my mind is in this next season of our company, things are really going to sort of a next level scale more than I've ever been exposed to before. And I'm having to scale in character alongside this company, meaning, I still feel like a kid. I don't feel like I'm some sort of adult or anything. Like, yes, I'm 31, but I feel like I'm 22. Like, if that makes sense. Like, I just feel like I'm a kid who's never really done much. And I don't know, like I've never built a company before. And the fact that I don't know, a lot of people around me are in their 40s, 50s, some in their 60s. And like, we're having to hire sort of a more mature C-suite and all of that around me. It's something where I realize that I'm going to have to continue being more and more above reproach in the way that I'm handling situations. And I guess what I mean by that is, so I think in general, like candidly, because I have a level of conviction that's rooted in faith, I already don't really act out that much compared to a lot of other CEOs, but there's certain situations where in my head, I'm like there's like a war in my head where I'm just like having to fight patience and things like that. And people, they probably don't see it nearly as much externally because it's in my head. But
your face looks the same regardless.
Exactly. I'm straight faced and angry all the time anyway. So there's that, but then also there's I think even just the idea of me not having to have that war as much in my head because I'm slower to anger, or I'm slower to be impatient, or I'm more patient naturally or intrinsically, right? And so essentially just like kind of growing in patience and understanding, because I think that I always want things to work a certain way, and I'm just like, why doesn't it just work? But not realizing that humans are messy, nothing is black and white, everything's a lot more grayish, and not because it's intrinsically black and white versus gray, but rather I am a human and I have limitations and I can't see everything the way that God can see it. And so because of that, things are going to look more confusing than they really should be, but it's also because I'm not God and I don't know the perfect way to operate. And so neither do the people around me. And so just knowing that, since that is the case, just being more patient, long-suffering, caring, empathetic, all of that. And I think sort of in this next season of our company, knowing that there's others around me who are also going to be growing in that process, knowing that there are times where we're not going to hit certain goals, or certain situations are not going to be handled as well as I would hope that they would be, knowing that we're all in sort of this growing process. There are times where it can definitely feel tiring, because there are times where I just sort of wish that people would learn it on their own and I wouldn't have to be as involved with it, just because I'm doing a million other things, but also being okay with that and knowing that maybe I do need to be part of the process because that's the way that God's ordaining this thing to be. So yeah, maybe that sounds kind of general, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful.
So you want to be a little bit more patient, and
patience probably the biggest word. Yeah.
That's always a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where do you see yourself and your company 10 years from now?
Taking over the world. I'm just kidding. I mean, I think that we want to.
Elon's got his feet on that, right?
Yeah, he's doing the best so far, but we'll acquire them someday. I'm just kidding. I don't know, like we truly do believe that we're building the next version of the internet. I know it sounds kind of grandiose or massive or whatever, and it might just sound like a kid dreaming today, but we really do, like, as of right now, we just have the most used app in AR VR history. There's just no other AR VR app that people are using 40 to 50 hours a week every week. Immersed is the only app that does that, period. And so all these tech giants who are pouring dozens of billions of dollars into AR VR, who are creating all these different headsets, not only are they trying to buy us, they're trying to figure out the secret sauce, they're trying to figure out how to get that type of usage. And they want to bring that in-house at their companies. But for us, we want to be the next Facebook or Apple or whatever, rather than just sort of joining one of those. And so in 10 years, the hope is that Immersed can be another tech giant, but a tech giant run by a believer, if that makes sense. Because, candidly, if Facebook was run by a believer, or if Apple was run by a believer or whatever, I think our world would look very different. I think that it would be more acceptable to be a Christian in our world. And for me, I don't really care whether or not the Lord makes this thing successful, because he can have his own way, and I trust whatever his goals are. But I think that'd be pretty fun. It'd be difficult, but I think it'll be fun to live in a world where that was the case. So we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, that's really fun. Yeah, it's interesting to envision, because when you were 21, did you think this would be your life today?
No, even a year ago, I like, it's just every year I try to guess where I'm going to be 12 months from now, and I'm always wrong. A year ago, I didn't realize, I can't announce too much just yet, because we're going to announce more stuff this summer, but there's just this sort of next level amount of funding that Immersed is receiving. And a year ago, even 2 months ago, I had no idea that would be the case. I had no idea things would accelerate this quickly. And I'm grateful for it, especially because we're currently in a recession, and every other founder is just trying to figure out how to keep the lights on. And so that's why I'm just super grateful that the Lord is going before us and fighting on our behalf, and just making things, like, it's crazy because people think that, like, the 12 million we raised is a lot. And I'm like, well, wait till you find out what happened the past month. Like, this summer, when we get to announce a lot of that stuff, I think it's going to blow everyone's minds. And, like, I'm just excited for how that's going to rally not only the Malayali community who's invested in Immersed and follows our progress, but also the church all around the US has been part of our story, or even just people who went to our colleges and our high schools and all of that, who've been behind the story of Immersed. I just feel like this is going to be a really awesome win for a lot of people. And so I'm just really excited for what's going to be announced this summer. Yeah.
That's exciting.
I can't say too much. Yeah.
I feel like you always have, like, we're going to tell you, and then you tell us, and then there's something else to tell us. And so,
yeah, well, it's funny because every single time I have something to say, there's always something bigger that's coming. I'm like, oh, all right, well, that makes the last thing not seem that big. And that's not the goal. It's just the Lord just keeps outdoing himself through Immersed. And I'm grateful for it.
That's awesome. Is there something you would like the listeners to know if they are hesitant themselves about making a bold move?
Yeah. It sounds kind of trite or cliche or whatever, but you only got one life to live, dude. And, like, what's the point of living a mediocre, boring life? I think the more I think about that, the more it makes me want to really give it my all. And I'm the type of person who, by the time, I die, I don't want to look back and feel like I rested well. I personally want to look back and feel like I have nothing left in the tank. And that I, played this game as well as possible, or I gave it my all. And so that's why I think I work tirelessly, or, become a master of my craft tirelessly, or surround myself with people who really want to be masters of their craft. Like, I love when people really love the fact that they get to live life, if that makes sense. Like, people really, like, even if you're the type of person who loves watching movies, for example, will be the best movie critic you can be, whatever it is, right? Or just, like, there's a way in which it can add value. And so I think in general, like, if you're living a life that's just to collect a 9-to-5 paycheck for, between the ages of 18 to 65 until you retire, and then you have another maybe 10 years left to actually enjoy your life. And then, you look back and you're like, crap, I wasted the first 85% of my life. Now I just have the last 15% left. That's personally not a life that I would be excited to live. And so I'd rather do that now for the next 50 years if I can, Lord willing. So.
Okay, because you're brown, important question. Do you have a curry plant?
My wife does, yeah. And she's not brown.
Curry leaf plant, yeah.
Yeah. The main thing that she cooks is Indian food, even though she's not Indian. My mom's the one who taught her how to cook. Her mom didn't really teach her how to cook. And so she mainly only cooks Indian food. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, then I'm probably going to need lessons from her, because I hardly cook Indian food, even though my kids loved it when they were here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but I'm a nacho pizza girl from scratch
Oh, wow.
anytime I can.
Wow. Well, that's because you do it for fun. So,
Yeah, it's like what I gravitated towards. The very first American food my parents had when they came to America was New York pizza. So it's
oh,
like
wow.
ingrained in me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
Oh, cool. Well, is there anything that you'd like to share with people that's coming up for you, or how can they follow you and hear more about Immersed?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Instagram is the social media platform that I engage with the most. So you can look me up, Renji.Bijoy. There's a lot of fakes out there, so don't follow the fakes.
Don't
Um,
follow the fakes, report them.
yeah, yeah. Go to the one that actually posts Instagram stories. The other ones don't post stories. Apparently, they haven't figured out how to fake my face on a camera. So at least yet. And so yeah, follow me there. You'll see links to Immerse and things like that. Yeah, I mean, our goal is to really live life to the fullest, and we do that in a number of ways, whether it be work or through faith. And so, feel free to follow us.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you all for listening and joining us on this episode of Being Brown and Bold. We will be back here next week to drop our next episode. Till then, be wise and be bold.